Chestnut Hill Studios presents The Parent Plague, a short story by Mark Tufo. Copyright 2023 by Devil Dog Press. Read to you by Jeff Royds. Bryce was supposed to be in school. In fact, in a strange twist of fate, he would have preferred it. Due to the newest outbreak of COVID-19, the Parola variant, Walpole High School had closed its doors and returned to remote learning. He loathed sitting in front of his laptop all day. He had difficulty concentrating as it was, having received the catch-all diagnosis of borderline ADHD back in the second grade. Mrs. Stallings was droning on about some obscure event that happened in the late 1800s, and he couldn't help continually look over at the kitchen counter in the sleeve of English muffins. His stomach was grumbling, and break wasn't for another hour.
Mr. Hamill, is something more interesting than my lecture?
Mrs. Stallings' tinny voice came through the subpar speaker. Bryce didn't hear her, as he was hyper-focused on the breakfast fare.
Mr. Hamill, do you wish for me to once again send an email to your parents?
It was a snicker of his classmates that got his attention. What? He asked. More laughter.
Mr. Hamill, I would like for you to tell me what led to the Second Industrial Revolution in America.
Bryce stared blankly into the camera. He could feel heat traveling up the sides of his neck. He was close to slamming the screen down, but it was Friday, and more importantly, it was Halloween. If Shirley Stallings, as she was commonly known among the class, emailed his parents, he would be grounded for the entire weekend, and more importantly, for this most special of nights, and that just wouldn't do. Mass production and rapid scientific discovery, he blurted out. Mrs. Stallings was taken aback by his response. She'd not been expecting him to have anything to contribute, and certainly not an intelligent answer.
Yes, that is partially correct. Good job. Pay more attention, and you could have had the entire answer.
I know the answer, Susie piped up. Of course you do, you little brown noser, Mrs. Stallings thought. She'd known for a few years that she needed to change her profession. She never really liked children, and this job only reinforced her opinion. Susie droned on, and now that the attention was taken off Bryce, he again looked longingly off towards the kitchen. Once the hour was finally up, he had a 10-minute break. He had gotten the muffin into the toaster and grabbed the OJ, then ended up spilling some on the counter. He cursed the time it was going to take to clean the mess up. He headed to the sink to grab the dish towel. As his head came up, his eyes traveled past the window. He took a step toward the spill, stopped. Frowning, he headed back to take a longer look. His neighbor, Mrs. Tasker, was in her backyard holding a mug of steaming coffee. She was pretty, in an older woman's way, but her daughter, Tawny, a senior at his school, made his heart pound every time he saw her. Even as neighbors, she barely acknowledged his presence. And in school, where he was a freshman, he may as well have not even existed. Still, it was hard not to look at Mrs. Tasker and realize the beauty she must have been when she was in school. He stared raptly at her as only a hormone-infused male can, hoping he didn't get caught, but knowing even if he did, it would be worth it. A minute later, his little bit of voyeurism took a strange turn. For the entire time he'd been oogling her, the only thing that had moved was the steam rising from her coffee. Is she all right? Bryce cocked his head, wondering if she was having a stroke or some medical issue. He had a brief thought of Tawny expressing her gratitude in a very X-rated manner for saving the life of her mother. He knew the odds of that were slim, but they weren't zero. He tapped on the window to get the woman's attention. Instead of being startled and possibly spilling some coffee, her head, and only her head, as if it were on a pivot, turned towards him. Her eyes focused on him, and an unnatural smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. A long second later, her arm came up, as if it were being pulled by an invisible string, and her hand twisted back and forth like she was Miss America waving from a float at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Mr. Hamill! Mr. Hamill! I am trying to take attendance. If you don't show up this minute, I'm going to mark you as absent.
Mr. Chavez called out from the forgotten computer. Shit. Bryce looked away from the window toward the laptop, to the forgotten English muffin charred beyond recognition, and then back to the window. Mrs. Tasker was nowhere to be found. What the?
I suggest you don't finish that sentence, Mr. Hamill.
Sorry. Bryce hurried across the kitchen and slid into his chair. By the time he wondered why he had to take a remote gym class, he'd already forgotten about the strange behavior of his good-looking neighbor. Bryce's phone lit up to the side. It was on silent, and he was cautious to keep it out of view of the camera, which had a surprisingly wide angle. He smiled as he read the text. Can't believe we're learning the origins of dodgeball. This is so stupid. One of his best friends, Teddy, had texted. His name was Theodore, but Teddy would punch anyone who called him that. You never know when you're going to need to dodge a gym ball, theoretically, Bryce texted back. We still on for tonight? Of course, Bryce answered. Although he wasn't sure how much he actually wanted to break into the long-closed mental hospital the next town over. It was reputed to be haunted, of course, and many swearing they could hear screams of the disturbed patients who had died there over the years, crying out for help. He wondered if maybe he should skip one of his classes and have his parents ground him. Couldn't be blamed for not going if he couldn't leave the house. Gotta go. Mom's coming. I really wish he'd turn autocorrect back on, Bryce thought. The last thing he wanted to think of was Teddy's mom tossing one off. After gym, he suffered through algebra. The only thing making it somewhat bearable was that lunch immediately followed. The bell to signify the end of class hadn't even finished trilling when Bryce stood up, pressed down the screen, and went to the toaster to grab the muffin and toss it. He had it in his hand heading toward the trash when the doorbell rang repeatedly, and fists hammered on the door. Open the door! Someone was yelling from outside. Please, hurry up! The bounty became more frantic. Bryce hurried to the door and opened it. He'd not been expecting a fantasy of his to come pushing in past him. Tawny Tasker had a towel wrapped around her chest and barely covering her long legs. Her long blonde hair was wet, as if she had just gone skinny dipping in the ocean, though more likely she had just gotten out of the shower. The fantasy was snapped when he saw the fear etched on her face. Shut the door! Shut the door! She yelled as she retreated further into the house, heading straight for the kitchen. Bryce shut the door, locked it, and followed her, wondering what was going on. He wished he had his phone so he could text Teddy and tell him what was going on. He'd have to take a picture, because his friend would never believe him. Tawny? Bryce asked as he tentatively entered the kitchen. Is everything all right? She was on her tiptoes looking out the kitchen window. If she raised up any higher, Bryce was going to get a view he would remember for the rest of his life. He begrudgingly turned away. Did you lock the door? She asked. I did, he told her without looking. What's going on? She brushed past him to check. When they made contact, he felt like his skin was going to spontaneously combust. My mother. I mean, the thing pretending to be my mother. Tawny was going from window to window, making sure everything was locked. What about her? Where's your phone? We need to call the police. Looking at her, he thought an ambulance might be better. Only it would be for him in the heart attack he was about to suffer. They both turned to the kitchen when his phone began to ring. Bryce's eyebrows furrowed. He had it on silent. Who is it? Her eyes grew wide as she asked the question. I don't know how I can know that from here. Can you maybe tell me why you want me to call the cops on your mom? He asked as he went to retrieve his phone. He snatched it up quickly. The contact was listed as future girlfriend. It wasn't technically Tawny's number, but rather the Tasker's home phone. It's your mom. He couldn't hand it to her with that showing on the display, so he pressed the green answer button. Don't answer that! She held her hands up as Bryce tried to hand the phone off. Hello, Bryce. Hang up, Tawny mouthed. Bryce meant to do just that. Instead, hit the speaker button. The voice became a growl. I know you're there, you little turd. Hand the phone to that bitch, will you? Or I'm going to slice your balls off with a butter knife. Do you hear me, you perverted little piece of shit? I know what you do to yourself. What you fantasize about at night when you think you're all alone. Does that bitch of mine know you whack your pathetic little fuckstick to photos of her you took on your phone? Tawny's eyes grew wide as she looked at Bryce. His face had turned fire engine red. I don't know what she's talking about, he pleaded. Mrs. Tasker laughed. I bet you're pretty surprised about now, honey. Why don't you come on home?
We'll talk about the birds and the bees, and then I'll slice through your carotid artery and let you bleed out on the toilet.
Mom, what's the matter with you? Tawny was on the verge of tears, terrified of her mother, and now scared to be alone with Bryce.
I'm not going to ask you twice, sweetie. Come on home now, and I'll make your death no more traumatic than one of the numerous naps you take while the rest of your loyal subjects go about tending to your every fucking whim, you selfish little cunt!
Bryce pressed end call. The silence that hung between them was an unbridgeable gap. I have to go. Where? Bryce asked. Janet's? Maybe Denise's? I can't stay here. She looked at the phone in his hand like it was a murder weapon. Let me get you some clothes. You can't walk around like that. Was she telling the truth about your phone? Bryce was afraid his head was going to explode like a bursting pimple as blood again flushed his face. It's not like that. Really? What's it like then, Bryce? He didn't have much experience with women. None, in fact. But he knew enough to realize when someone was on the verge of hysterics. There's nothing gross about them, okay? I took a couple of candid shots. Let me see. She snatched the phone out of his hand. He was going to protest, tell her they had more important things they should be doing, but she was already going through his files, and she quickly found the one labeled Tawny. There were 10 pictures in all. She looked at 3 of them, looked up at Bryce, then scrolled through another 2 before looking at him again. The anger in her face diminished. He hoped she would stop before she got to the 10th and final picture. It was from earlier this summer, and she was preparing to go to the beach with her friends. She had been dressed in a bright purple bikini top, yellow short shorts, and white tennis shoes. It was slightly blurred as he rushed the shot, and the only one not artfully taken. She did not stop. Looking at all of them, she handed the phone back when she was done. You took those? He nodded. I'm not talking about the subject because, contrary to what others might say about me, I'm not conceited, okay? If anything, I'm self-conscious. But those pictures, they're beautiful. I wanted to capture you unaware, the real person you are, the smiles, the laughs, the introspection, not the fake cheerleader persona you go through the halls with. And the last one? He stuttered. He was saved from further embarrassment when the doorbell rang. Ding dong, dipshits! Mrs. Tasker sang out. There was a scraping against the door as she dragged her knife, etching deeply into the wood. I cannot wait until this blade tastes blood. I'm going to push slowly, savoring as the point indents your skin. There will be some pain from the pressure, but that will pale in comparison to when it finally pierces the parts of the flesh, cutting through muscle, splitting veins, and then arteries. We can only hope I press in far enough to cut into a major organ. Oh, what fun that will be! Mom, why are you doing this? Mom, why are you doing this? Mrs. Tasker mocked with a snaring, simpering voice. Because I fucking want to. How about that? You know how parents kid around and say, I brought you into this world, I can take you out? Well, I'm not kidding. So sick of catering to you and your sniveling, selfish ways. We could go out the back, Bryce said. Go knock on one of the neighbors' doors, get some help. Tawny was near the front door. Mom, why are you doing this? Tears streamed down her face. I suppose I can add stupid to your less than stellar attributes. Tawny was starting to back up as Mrs. Tasker renewed her efforts to break the door down. She finally quit when she realized the door wasn't going to budge. Well, I suppose there's more than one way to skin a daughter. A red paver from the front walkway crashed through the picture window in the living room. She stuck her deranged face through the offensive lineman-sized opening. What's that line again, honey? I'm back. No, maybe I'm home. What's it matter? I can look it up later, after I'm done eviscerating you. She smashed out the remaining glass with the knife blade. Tawny was frozen, her hands cupping her mouth, eyes wide in terror. She jumped when Bryce grabbed her elbow. Come on, Tawny, we have to go, he urged. That's my mom, was all she managed, her expression glazed, her mind dazed. Bryce yanked Tawny away just as Mrs. Tasker popped her head through the impromptu entry. She licked her lips wildly as she spied the 2 teenagers. Tawny hesitated at the back door. I'm I'm in a towel. I need to get ready. I have school. Bryce had limited experience with people going into shock. The only examples he had were from movies or television shows. But if he had to guess, he was certain that's what was happening with her. What he was supposed to do about it was beyond him. He would find an adult and ask them for help. He could hear Mrs. Tasker pulling herself through the window as he rummaged around in the closet. He came out with his dad's winter jacket. It was too large for Tawny and far too heavy for the mild temperatures outside. But they couldn't delay their escape any longer. Tawny was about as responsive as a mannequin as he fitted the coat on her. It wasn't until they crossed the yard, went out to the gate, and were in the alley that he realized she had no footwear on. Shit! He looked back at the house. He could hear Mrs. Tasker yelling something about sucking Tawny's spleen out with a straw. They couldn't go back there. He spun his gaze to the street. He could see Mr. Johnson, the mailman, coming down the block, staring down into his mail satchel, seemingly grabbing the next home's offerings of magazines, junk mail, and bills. Bryce was pulling on a more willing Tawny as he headed toward the man. But something was wrong. He wasn't moving. "Where's my welfare check, asshole?" Mrs. Tasker called out from the back porch. "Huh?" The mailman looked up from what he was doing, his eyes first sweeping past the two teenagers, and then the wild-eyed woman yelling. Bryce paused when he saw Mr. Johnson's face. "Mr. Johnson?" he asked tentatively. Tawny, as an object in motion, continued forward, now pulling Bryce along as he glanced behind them. Mrs. Tasker had suddenly stopped rigid on the porch, and Bryce looked back and forth. He wasn't entirely certain what was going on, but there was some form of communication going on between the two adults. Maybe Mrs. Tasker was uploading and Mr. Johnson downloading. But all Bryce knew was that whatever code was being exchanged between them, it was infected with the virus. "We need to go," Bryce warned, stopping Tawny. "Help is right there," she cried. The mailman shook his head once, then twice, then kept shaking it faster and faster, to the point where Bryce was convinced he was going to liquefy his brains, and the next image they would have of their mailman would be watching his gray matter leak from his nose and mouth, thick globs of pink and gray running down his chin and coating the blue USPS jacket he was wearing. As suddenly as it started, it stopped, and his eyes locked on Bryce's. "Don't go anywhere, you little pecker. I'm going to fillet you with this letter opener I got for my birthday," he said as he rooted around his oversized bag, searching for the unlikely weapon and not watching the kids at all, as if he expected them to do as he commanded. "What?" Tawny tumbled to a halt. She cried out as she rolled the big toe on her left foot across the uneven crack of the coarse cement sidewalk. She scraped enough skin off the top that she was bleeding. "My foot!" She hobbled slightly as Bryce changed direction, attempting to put as much distance as he could between them and the two adults who had lost their minds, or had them taken over. The strange thought blurred across his mind. Bryce glanced back. Mr. Johnson was chasing them. "Tawny, hurry! I'm running as fast as I can. Stop being a dick. Everyone's being a major dick today. I just want to get dressed, go to school, and get away from you all as fast as I can. If anybody who matters sees me with you, I'm going to have to explain it." "Why's that?" Bryce asked, but didn't slow down. "You're a loser. Licey Brycey. It's as simple as that. Are you one of them?" He had slowed while letting go of Tawny's elbow. Mr. Johnson was still in hot pursuit, although luckily, if the man had ever been fast, those days were decades past, and it was more like a lukewarm pursuit. "One of them?" She was hysterical now. "I don't need to be one of them to know you're pathetic. I just helped you." "So? I acted nice so you would. It's called using what you've got to get what you want, dumbass. And you helping me was what you're supposed to do. If you think that somehow entitles you to something, you're sadly mistaken. Now, if you could go run in a different direction than this, I'm going to find someone worthy of saving me." "What's that even mean?" he asked, dumbfounded as Tawny continued to run. "Don't you dare follow me. I can feel your greasy gaze on my legs. Take a mental picture, loser. Maybe if you live through the day, you could jack off to it later. This can't be real." But Mr. Johnson, wielding a very nice wooden letter opener, raised high and ready to strike, looked real enough. Bryce was okay with pinching himself to see if this was a nightmare, but was not up for being pierced with a giant splinter to know for sure. He began to run again. "Figures," he said as he realized the mailman had veered off and was following him, and not Tawny. Bryce heard Tawny cry out and turned just in time to see her fall to the ground. She rolled and was holding her foot in the air. "Help me, Bryce!" The words were drawn out to the point it took on a surreal quality, like it wasn't even his name. "I was joking," she wailed. Even as far away as he was from her, he could see thick rivulets of blood flowing from her injury. "I stepped on glass. It's still in there. Get it out!" She was wailing now. The response on the tip of his tongue was to fuck off. But that wasn't the person he was, or wanted to be. There were already plenty of people in this world that would kick another when they were down. He didn't want to be added to their ranks. Mr. Johnson, like a shark smelling blood and water, changed his direction. Bryce was fairly confident he could beat the mailman to Tawny's shrieking form, but there wasn't any chance in this hellish reality he found himself in that he was going to beat Mrs. Tasker there. "Hurry up!" Tawny cried out, seeing the same thing he was. "Why didn't I grab a bat or something?" Bryce berated himself for his lack of foresight, then gave himself a break for not being able to predict that the last two adults he'd encountered would be psychotic wannabe murderers. Mrs. Tasker's mouth was twisted in a mask of rage, and drool poured down the edges. Her body was drenched in sweat, and a high keening sound was whistling from her nose. Bryce wondered if it had something to do with whatever was happening to her, or it was because of the 2 packs a day she smoked. Tawny was doing her best to back away, using her hand and one good leg to crawl along. When Mrs. Tasker was close enough, she dove like she was Superman, leading with her knife-wielding hand. Bryce stopped running toward the burgeoning group the moment he saw the tip of the large knife pierce Tawny's side. She bellowed, a shrieking scream ripping through the day. Tawny's eyes grew wide, her chest and stomach fluttering like a hummingbird's wings. She was quiet. She wanted to scream, but her lung was punctured, and she had no air to spare. "Mom, please," she croaked. "Stop." Mrs. Tasker stood, leaving the knife embedded deeply into her daughter's ribcage, paying no attention to the bleeding scrapes on her knees she got from when she slid along the sidewalk. "Now, was that so hard?" she asked, sparing a moment to pull out a cigarette and light it. "I can't remember the last time you said please to me, much less thank you, you ungrateful little bitch. If I had known what a piece of shit you were going to turn out to be, I would have wrapped the umbilical cord around your neck myself and saved everyone who's had to deal with you a lot of trouble." "Mom." Tawny reached a hand up. "Give it a rest." Mrs. Tasker slapped the hand away and down. Bryce's mouth was agape. Hurting someone was horrible. Having it done by a family member, even more so. But the cold-hearted disdain was something he could not even begin to understand. Mr. Johnson, without so much as a nod to Mrs. Tasker, dropped to his knees next to Tawny and plunged the letter opener into her neck. Her chest increased its frantic pace before slowing and stopping completely. A part of Bryce hoped they were going to rip her body open and begin to eat her internal organs. He could almost deal with zombies. They were mindless beings driven by only one need. Creatures that did what they did because they knew no other way. But this was not that. And his young mind had no idea what to do with the discordant information it was receiving. The mailman stood. He turned to face Bryce, and without any verbal communication, he and Mrs. Tasker began a new chase, directed at him. What he was able to figure out was that he needed to keep moving. Bryce was 15 and in decent shape. He jogged nearly every day, but this was different. The stress of a flat-out sprint, then having to run about 2 miles, left him out of gas. He put some significant distance between him and Tawny's mother, and even more so than the mailman. But they were still following. And somehow, the chain-smoking murderer looked as if she could keep it up all day. "Bryce, my man! What are you up to?" His friend Teddy Brewer called out from his porch. "You look like shit. And where were you last period? Mrs. Killarney marked you as absent. You know your folks are gonna be pissed if you miss any more school. Are you ready for tonight? I got 3 dozen eggs stashed. Wouldn't mind getting some candy, though. Would it be weird if we did some trick-or-treating? Do you think Carl would say anything?" Carl was a third in their small circle of friends. Where Bryce was at or near the median in every imaginable spectrum of measurement, Teddy was tall, gangly, and had a mop of red hair that he was teased about mercilessly. Their third, Carl, was a few inches shorter than Bryce, but almost twice as wide. And out of the trio, he was somehow the most athletic, lettering in 2 sports. "Donnie," Bryce gulped. "Shit, where?" Teddy looked around for the crush of most of the school. "Wait, is that Mrs. Tasker? Why is she chasing you?" "Why is she chasing you, Bryce? Did she catch you outside Tawny's room tossing one off? Spanking the monkey? Needling the old loaf?" He laughed, making lewd gestures as he spoke. "Killed Tawny?" Bryce was completely out of breath. "What?" Teddy was concerned. "You killed her? Fuck, man!" He ran his hands through his hair. The resultant grease would have been enough to fry potatoes. "Not me." He bent over, hands on knees. "Her." He pointed backwards. "Fuck me," Teddy whispered. "Why's the mailman running? I've never seen him run. My dad complains how slow he walks. He says he's late on his payments because it takes Mr. Johnson so long to get us the bill." "He helped." "Bryce, what are you talking about? Why would Mrs. Tasker and Mr. Johnson kill Tawny? Are you sure you saw what you saw?" "The house. In." Bryce went up the porch steps and pushed his friend inside. "Does she have blood on her?" Teddy was hopping backwards as he was being forced inside. By the time Mrs. Tasker got onto the porch, Bryce had caught his breath. When she rang the doorbell, he had to stop Teddy from answering the door. "Did you not hear anything I just said? This some sort of Halloween practical joke, man? I want to make sure the camera catches my shocked expression. I've always wanted to be an actor. I have the looks for it." "Teddy, Bryce, come on out. I want to talk to you about delivering to your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, in the most violent manner possible," Mrs. Tasker crackled. "Wow, she's really getting into her part. I hope she doesn't overshadow my performance." "Teddy, this isn't some show. This is real." "Jesus, Bryce, you been taking lessons? That was super convincing. If I wasn't already in the know, I wouldn't know." Mr. Johnson was next on the porch. "Teddy, I need you to open the door. I have your death certificate, and I need you to sign for it." "Wow, that is a hell of a nice touch. Who's writing their material? Is it you?" Teddy was smiling at his friend. He was rooting around in the broom closet next to the front door. He found a bat and a hockey stick. The latter he tossed to Teddy, who missed. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Teddy avoided the piece of equipment like it was catchy. A rock crashed through the front bay window. "What the hell, Mrs. Tasker? My dad's gonna be pissed!" Teddy yelled. "Oh, that was just a mistake. Come on out and we'll discuss how I can pay you back, right after I slice through your stomach, cutting into your intestines. Then I'm going to shove a pair of pliers up your nose and pull them through your sphincter." "That's not even remotely funny." Teddy turned to Bryce. "They can't show that on YouTube." "Teddy, I'm going to say this one more time. This isn't a joke. She means what she's saying." Teddy gulped and subconsciously placed his hands on the seat of his pants. "You're kidding, right?" Teddy asked the question, for Bryce could see that he was finally getting through to him. "Does your dad have a gun?" Teddy appeared confused. "It's locked in a safe." Both boys jumped as another window was broken. Mr. Johnson poked his head inside, paying no attention as glass ripped through his cheek. He gripped the windowsill and began to pull himself through. Teddy bent and picked up the hockey stick, gripping it tightly and pulling it close to his body while backing up. "Oh, fuck no, I'm sick of running!" Bryce shouted as he reared back and ran toward the breaking and entering man. "What are you doing?" Teddy looked on in horror as Bryce swung and connected to the top of the mailman's skull. There was a disturbing loud crack of bone breaking, but it did nothing to deter the man from trying to gain entry. "He should be dead!" Teddy backed up again. Bryce pulled the bat back again and struck Mr. Johnson. His head spurting blood, had pulled himself all the way in and fallen to the floor. Bryce swung again as the man began to stand. "No, no, no!" Teddy said as he went to help his friend. He hooked the back of the mailman's leg and pulled him over. Bryce was hammering away at the mailman's head like it was a railroad spike, and he was an 1800s Chinese immigrant. Mr. Johnson's legs kicked the air wildly as his skull was shattered, and shards of bone were sent deep into his brain. Bryce didn't stop until what was left of the man's face was unrecognizable. Then, he vomited on top of the bloody pulp. Teddy ran out of the room. "Oh my God, Bryce!" "I know, man. I know. He killed Tawny, and he was going to kill us," Bryce said as he dragged the back of his hand over his mouth. "No, that's not it, man. I shit my pants." "Wait, what?" Bryce turned to look into the kitchen, then thought better of it. He'd seen enough horrors for the day. "I shit my pants, and not the giant log kind either. Looks like brown Vesuvius went off of my underwear." Teddy began to gag. "Who shits themselves when murdering a postman? I need to take a shower." Teddy was naked as he walked past Bryce and headed upstairs. "Teddy, Mrs. Tasker's out there. We need to go." "Bryce, I shit myself. I'm taking a goddamn shower." Teddy headed up the stairs. Bryce heard the door shut and the water start. His heart lurched when he saw Mrs. Tasker pointing her head through the broken window. "What have you done?" she cried. "You killed him. Why?" "What? You were going to kill us." "It was a joke, a prank. You killed Mr. Johnson." "A prank?" Bryce's heart began to pick up pace, thumping wildly. He was moments away from a panic attack. "It's Halloween. It's a prank." "But you killed Tawny." "Why would I kill my own daughter? I love her. This was all her idea. She was going to put the whole thing on YouTube." I... Shut up, you stuttering fool. How could you kill your own mailman?" Tears streamed down her face. "It was an accident," Bryce pleaded. "Bashing someone's skull in with a bat is hardly an accident, Bryce. I didn't know, she mimicked. "God, you're a little twat. You should see your face." "What?" "Tawny said you were a little dim. I just figured she was being her normal bitchy self. Come to find out, she wasn't kidding. We totally killed her." She laughed. Mrs. Tasker held her nose and fanned at the air. "Seems like your friend doesn't have the stomach for it. But you do, don't you, boy?" She looked down at the pulverized head of Mr. Johnson. "Feels good, right? Get all your angst, frustration, and fear. You take all that negative energy and you focus it, direct it into something truly evil. I'm proud of you, kid. I still have to kill you, but now I'm not going to take you too lightly. Just because you're a little slow doesn't mean you don't have gumption. Does the phone still work here? Not your cell. You'll want to use a landline so they can locate this place quicker. Have you called the police yet?" she asked. "Phone is in the kitchen. Go on. I'll wait right here. Don't worry. I don't want to end up like him." "Why do you want me to call the police? Are you going to try to set me up? Say I killed Tawny and Mr. Johnson?" Mrs. Tasker scoffed. "Have you ever heard of forensics? Mr. Johnson stabbed her with his letter opener and it's still in his hand. If you move that little bit of brain and teeth, you could see it. And I still have the knife I stabbed her with." She held it up so he could see it. "Plus, all the blood on my clothes? Clearly, you acted in self-defense. Fairly open and shut case. Your lawyer will be able to clear it right up." "Lawyer? Call the police, Bryce, and this will be over soon." "Don't move," he shouted, pointing the bat at her. She smirked and raised her hands as if she'd never even thought about it. Bryce ran full speed into the kitchen. He slipped on Teddy's discarded shit-stained pants, reached out, and caught the corner of the counter, just keeping himself from landing on top of them. He grabbed the phone and pulled on the cord so he could peer around the corner to keep an eye on Mrs. Tasker. "Hurry," she shooed him with her hand. "I'm not going to wait around all day to unlife you." What a strange word. Your generation is so afraid of hurtful words, you have to change all the good ones. Doesn't change the underlying meaning, though. Unlife is still death, and I cannot wait to stick this blade hilt deep into your meat sack. Exquisite. She licked the blood off the flat of the blade. Bryce gulped as he dialed the number. Incredulously, he was met with the busy signal. "What's the matter, Bryce? You look like your crush made fun of your pinky-sized dick." "Oh, that's right." She slapped a hand on the side of her face. "She did do that. See, aren't you glad I shoved this knife right through her ribs and into the organs that held the air that produced those hurtful words?" I did that for you. No, that's a lie. I did it because it felt so good. I didn't know stabbing could be so sensual. You see, Mr. Tasker likes to stab, but in this case, it's with his little needle dick. Well, it's so small, he goes so fast, I can't feel anything. It's like he's sewing a button. Want to know the fucked up thing about this? Mr. Tasker convinced me we should wait until we were married before we had sex. He said it was a sin otherwise. What did I know? I was young. But on our wedding night, when he pulled his pants down, it would have been hard for me to hide my disappointment. Maybe I had no experience, but I knew enough to realize that what I was looking at was on the far end of the bell curve, and not the good end either. I would have been thrilled with your pinky. His cock was less than an inch long and as girthy as a pencil. Sex with him was like scissoring with my college roommate, only more grunting and less fulfilling. Busy! Bryce was near tears. He wished she would stop talking. If at first you don't succeed. It's ringing, he said triumphantly. Hi, police? I need help. My neighbor killed her daughter, and me and Teddy killed the mailman. Help! It's crazy around here. She's looking in the window and threatening to stab me. Breathe, Bryce. They're going to think you're some nutso teenager on a dare if you don't speak intelligently. Hello? The dispatcher asked. Bryce looked warily at Mrs. Tasker. She wanted him to call the police, actively lobbied for it, but he couldn't figure out the reasoning behind it. My name is Bryce Hamill. I live at 10235 East Evans Avenue. My neighbor, Mrs. Tasker, killed her daughter, Tawny, and she's trying to kill me. Good. Mrs. Tasker nodded as she spoke. Are you inside the home? The dispatcher asked. No, I'm at my friend Teddy's house. He's at 10144 East Jewel Avenue. Teddy and I had to kill the mailman. He was trying to kill us too. And where is the mailman? The dispatcher asked, her voice as neutral as if she were discussing lawn maintenance. Inside Teddy's house, on the floor in the living room. He broke in. Did he threaten you? She asked. Did he threaten us? Bryce repeated. Technically, not once he entered. Would that count against them? Don't worry, sweetie. Mrs. Tasker was checking her nails. Our state has the castle doctrine. The what? Bryce asked. Means you can kill someone who enters illegally, and busting out a window and climbing in with a weapon would be covered under it. Just hurry up and get here. Don't go outside. The police are on their way. They're coming! Bryce shouted at Mrs. Tasker, expecting her to go running. He desperately wished she would. The spark of insanity that shone so brightly in her eyes frightened him to the core. She did not move. Excellent! I can finally get what's coming to me! Bryce? Teddy called from the top of the stairs. Yeah, he answered, not looking away from Mrs. Tasker. Everything okay down there? Sure. Mr. Johnson's brains are leaking out all over the floor. Mrs. Tasker and I are having a conversation, and your shitty pants are still on the kitchen floor. Other than that, everything's great. Oh, and I called the cops. Footsteps rapidly came down the stairs. The cops? What about all the eggs I have for tonight? I think we got bigger problems? Oh, you two are such naughty delinquents, Mrs. Tasker smiled. Do you maybe have some toilet paper too? Now they're waiting on the cops, and the crazy lady over there isn't trying to kill us. Why don't you tell me what happened? Teddy said. Bryce told him about how strange Mrs. Tasker was acting that morning, then the frantic knocking from Tawny. Wait, she was in a towel? You little mother! Dude, her mother's right there. I know, but Tawny Tasker and nothing but a towel inside your house. That's the stuff legends are made of. Teddy, focus! Bryce moved on to how they escaped the house and ran into Mr. Johnson. What was he doing? I mean, he was delivering mail. No, wait. When I saw him, he wasn't doing anything. Just standing there. Exactly the same thing as Mrs. Tasker was at first. She said something to him. Then he was as crazy as she was. They chased us here. You know the rest. Then I called the cops. Crazy lady here recommended it. Maybe she's ready to surrender. We gotta go, Teddy said just as the faint sound of a siren drifted through the window. Ah, I can see Teddy's the brains of the outfit. Very good, Mr. Brewer, she clapped. The cops are coming. Why do we have to go? Bryce knew he was missing something, but he had no idea what it was. This is your classic body snatcher scenario, dude. She had you call the cops because as soon as they show, she's going to pull her alien voodoo shit and make them like her. Then she'll have a bunch of people with guns trying to shoot us.
Just so we're clear, I'm not going to have them shoot you unless it becomes necessary. I would rather them detain you so I can stab you. I think I'll go slow with you, though. Killing Tawny was like having sex with her father. Over too quickly and without any satisfaction on my part. With you both, I'm going to do shallow stabs all over your body in non-vital areas first until I work up an orgasmic conclusion like I did with my Beth back in school.
Bryce, what is she talking about? Teddy asked as they headed out the back door. They could hear the police come to a skidding stop, the flashing of the reds and blues sweeping across the front of the house.
Put the knife down!
Bryce paused when he heard the command come through the bullhorn mounted on the police car. Dude, come on! Teddy was yanking on his arm.
But the cops are here. They got her.
Trust me, this shit is about to get worse.
Ma'am, put the...
Then nothing. Silence for a few heartbeats.
Officer!
Mrs. Tasker cried out.
My daughter and Postman's murderers went out the back door. Hurry! Catch them!
Her frantic voice switched to menacing.
Catch them and hold them still while I mutilate their bodies, she growled.
Bryce Hamill, Teddy Brewer, come out with your hands up. Mrs. Tasker wishes to gut you like fish, and we would like to watch. So sick of you entitled little fuckwad teenagers. It'll be a pleasure to get some revenge exacted for all the shit your generation puts me through.
But he's a cop.
Not anymore, Teddy said. What now? Bryce asked as he followed Teddy through the backyard. The only place that makes sense. Carl will already be there. So they ran. Bryce was able to find a reserve of energy he'd not known he had, but that tends to happen when you see a cop chasing you. His gun drawn and his finger on the trigger. Fat bastard, Teddy said as he hid behind a tool shed and watched Officer Davies waddle on down the street. Come on! Teddy smacked Bryce in the chest as they cut through another backyard, over the fence, down an embankment, and on to the train tracks. A quarter mile ahead was a trestle that led over a swift-flowing river.
Teddy, why are we going to Indian Hill, and why will Carl already be up here?
The fort was a tree log and wood structure that the boys had discovered on one of their many journeys onto the unclaimed land in their town. It was hidden deep within some brambles and would have never been found if Carl hadn't lost control of the drone he was flying and had to wade into the dense thickets to retrieve it. That was 4 years ago, and they'd enjoyed it ever since, like any group of preteen boys would. They'd grown older and had gone up to the hill less and less, and it was even rumored that the land had been sold to a developer and would become a housing complex soon. Teddy began speaking again. Carl said, if anything weird happened today, to head up to the hill. I consider this weird.
How'd he know? And why didn't he tell me?
You made it pretty clear about how forts are for little kids, and you don't want to come up here anymore.
Do you and Carl still come up here?
Teddy was silent as they hiked up the steep hill and came out to an expansive, lush valley.
Teddy,
Bryce halted. Yeah, man, we still come up here. We like it. Just because you don't doesn't mean we have to stop.
You could have invited me.
We try, Bryce. You say snobby stuff every time we do. It's just easier not to now.
With everything that Bryce had been through so far today, this hurt the most. His mom often said those closest to you would wound the deepest. He had no idea what that meant until just then. He'd never felt so betrayed.
Stop looking like someone stepped on your kitten. We come up once a week on Sunday mornings, and we miss you every time we do.
Fine,
Bryce snapped, but he did feel better.
They continued to walk through the clearing and back onto a path in the woods that wound around the hill.
Look, an early warning detection system, Teddy said, pointing at a translucent fishing line. We got it tied off here, and another one circles the area. No one could sneak up on us.
That been a big problem?
Bryce asked as Teddy held back a bush so that he could pass through the secret access trail to the fort. They widened the path a bit after the initial hidden entry to make the next 50 feet an easier hike. But brambles still snagged on your clothes if you didn't turn sideways through most of the pathway. Never, actually, but Carl says it's always better to be safe than sorry. Bryce said nothing. Carl's mom was a widow who spent the majority of her time on the internet, and more specifically, hunting down every conspiracy theory known to man. And as far as Bryce knew, she believed all of them. Flat Earth, the false moon landing, the U.S. government's hand in 9/11, the existence of Yetis, population control involving vaccines, and pharmaceutically induced zombies. Carl blew off most of them, but lately, he'd been talking more and more about the military facility located behind Mount Rushmore that housed alien and ancient artifacts, and now the New World Order was getting ready to enact its master plan. Their friend pushed aside the heavy green tarp and stepped outside the fort. He was holding a paintball gun. "Names," he commanded, pointing the welt-producing weapon. "It's me, Carl! Put the damn gun away!" Bryce shouted. "I've had too shitty of a day to deal with this." "You want to compare shitty days, Bryce? I woke up to my mother about to pour boiling bacon grease on my face. If my foot wasn't already off the edge of the bed, I'd be dead now." "Huh?" Bryce asked. "She ran into my room, woke me up. She told me she was glad I was awake because she wanted to hear all my screams. I kicked out, more because she startled the shit out of me than in response to her words. My foot caught the pan, spilled it all over her, coated her head. She never cried out as her fucking face melted. She looked at me as her eyes blackened and her nose slid to the side. So yeah, I'm having a hell of a day myself. I'll ask you again, what's your fucking name?" "Carl! Carl!" Teddy had his hands up. "It's me, Teddy and Bryce." "I didn't hear him say it." Carl thrust his chin out at Bryce. "It's Bryce," he said. "For all the good that does. Whatever's happening, people aren't losing their memories, just becoming possessed by other people or aliens." He looked at Teddy as he said that. "They're just changing, becoming like worst versions of themselves or something. I'd still know my name if I was infected." "Are you infected?" "Carl, we killed Mr. Johnson, and Mrs. Tasker killed Tawny." "Tawny's dead." "Her mom tried to kill us too," Bryce said. "The cops are looking for us now." "Questioning?" Carl asked. "Not the ones Mrs. Tasker got to. She's able to turn anyone she encounters." "Not anyone," Carl said, lowering the gun. "Only those close to her, and only those with a fully developed mind. So Teddy should be fine." It was the first smile the boys had shared. "If you knew so much, why'd you point the gun at us?" "I got the information off the internet just because my mom believed. Everything she read doesn't mean I do." "What's going on?" Teddy asked. "What did you read?" "Remember in history class we read about those students that tried to revolt in China? Tiananmen Square?" "Yeah?" Teddy's eyebrows furrowed. "The government cut all sorts of shit for their suppression tactics." "Yeah, squishing people under tanks tends to do that," Bryce said. "Yeah. So their government began to look for alternative ways to take care of their rebellious youth. They developed a signal they thought would make the kids go into berserker mode, so they could shoot them all. There's not a government in the world that's going to say anything derogatory about a nation attempting to control a violent horde. Problem was, the signal didn't do anything to pliable minds, but it fucked up the rigid brains of adults. One of the scientists monitoring the experiment walked into where the young prisoners were, started slashing at their faces with a scalpel. She was gouging eyes out, slicing off noses, just hacking away. There was so much blood, I thought the video was fake. She killed 4 of them before she was shot in the head by an army guy." "What does a lab in China have to do with us?" Bryce asked. "Yeah, this is where it gets fucked up," Carl said, motioning for the 2 boys to go inside. "Wow, this is different," Bryce said upon entering. 2 battery-powered lanterns were on, lighting up the 15 by 15 wood structure. A wall-to-wall outdoor carpet covered the entire floor. A fairly clean couch lined the far wall. Coolers flanked both sides. One was open, exposing soda and pilfered beers. A small table was in the center, and in the opposite corner was a stack of Playboys the former occupants had left behind. An empty frame had been hung around the carved initials of whom the boys figured were the original builders: DW, PG, DN, MT. Teddy headed over to the cooler and grabbed the tepid beer. "Want one?" he asked Bryce, who shook his head. Teddy shrugged and popped the top. It gave a lackluster whoosh. Teddy took a large gulp, not concerned that it was warm and nearly flat. "What's the fucked up part?" Bryce asked Carl. "Now, this is according to what my mom was reading, and we all know you can't trust everything you read.
especially online. This is why I don't bother to read. If you can't trust it, why bother?
Teddy sat down heavily on the couch, and a cloud of dust rose. Is it that it only works on adults and they're trying to kill young people? Bryce asked.
Yeah, I call that a success, Teddy said as he burped loudly. For them, I mean. Sucks for us. No. The fucked up part was they thought they could control it. The army guy who shot the scientist was exposed, but no one knew he was deranged because they hustled the remaining youngsters out after the scientist had slaughtered the other prisoners. So he finishes his shift and heads home. He was halfway there on a scooter when he saw this kid, like 10 years old, tossing a ball against a wall. He stops his scooter and, according to witnesses, walks up to the kid all calm-like, grabs him by the neck, and chokes him to death. Gets back on his scooter and drives off as if nothing happened.
What? How is this possible? When was this?
2 days ago. My mom read about it last night. How is it here already?
Teddy sucked down the rest of the beer and was debating on getting another one. He stifled a yawn and thought better about it.
There's limited news coming out of China because the country is burning to the ground, Carl said. The hacker group Politistate says there is some strange signal embedded in the YouTube video.
They didn't want to go down alone, Bryce said.
Wow. He sat down next to Teddy. Exactly. But this is the new world, man. Anyone can travel anywhere in the world. Why bother using a carrier wave?
Teddy asked. Carl shrugged.
Maybe they were afraid of a country closing their borders, halting the progress. The reasons don't matter so much now. The problem is that sooner rather than later, every adult we encounter is likely going to try and kill us.
Wait, no, Bryce said. That can't happen. My parents? Our teachers? How are we going to go to the store or a fast food joint?
Teddy, want to show him? Teddy clapped his knees and stood up. He went to the far corner and pulled up on the rug, revealing a piece of plywood covering a hole that had been dug in the ground. It was full of MREs, 2 rifles, and some bullets.
Are those real?
Bryce recoiled. His parents despise firearms. He'd not even been allowed to play with toy ones as a child. These were my mom's. I figured she's not going to need them anymore, Carl said. He turned away and wiped at his eyes.
We can't live here forever.
Bryce, I don't think you get it. What happened this morning is barely the beginning. In less than 2 days, China, one of the most powerful nations on the earth, was brought to its knees. Just think about how bad it's going to get here. We've got one of the most heavily armed populations ever. The world is over.
What are you talking about? Bryce didn't feel so good.
Think about it, Carl began. Adults are going to try and kill every kid they can. They won't get all of us, not at first. Just the law of averages. Let's say we survive.
He rotated his arm around to point at each of them.
We fight as best we can, and even if, by the strangest twist of fate, we somehow win. Although considering adults are in control of the military, that is so highly unlikely it's not statistically valid. Not in a million years. But whatever, we defy the odds. In a few years, we become our own enemies. I reach adulthood, and I turn on you. That will happen across the globe.
But Bryce held up his finger as he reeled in his thoughts. But if the adults are all gone, how is the signal being relayed? We'd be safe then.
Carl shook his head. Politistate said it's in all us now. Lying dormant. Kind of like the shingles virus. Waiting until a person reaches a certain age until it's activated. Like roof shingles? That's a virus? What the hell does it do?
Teddy had relented and grabbed another beer.
Carl disregarded the question. We can't win. There's no scenario where we can come out on top.
So we're just dead then?
Bryce couldn't accept that answer.
Is that what the rifles are for? We drink a couple of beers and say our goodbyes and end it?
That's one way,
Carl said with resignation.
I don't want to end up killing kids. I don't want to kill anyone else.
Off in the distance were subdued sounds of sirens and pops of weapons being discharged. Teddy grabbed the rifle, an AR-15. The other was a .30-06 deer rifle.
Carl, I have no idea how to load these, he said, holding them up. Carl stood up, bent over,
and reached into the small stowage, grabbed some magazines and bullets. Come here. Bryce, you need to learn this too. I don't want to. Yeah, well, I didn't want to kill my mom. We all do shit we don't want to do. Bryce reluctantly watched. The boys didn't do much that day, not even venturing out as they heard jets race by and helicopters fly over in search patterns. Not for the trio exactly, but for any available target. Carl had not been able to see the fort through the drone's camera. It was only when he'd stumbled into it that he had known it was there. It was just as unlikely that a helicopter would be able to see it. Maybe if they had infrared, but he couldn't account for everything. They were as safe as they could be, given the circumstances. On Carl's urging for information as night approached, Teddy had gone to the edge of the access, following a narrow path to Indian Hill, and then to the small valley itself. He climbed a single oak that stood in the center like a lone sentinel. From there, he could look down on the entire town. He lit a cigarette and took a deep drag as he peered down on his hometown. The lights were on. Most homes were lit. Cars were traveling about, headlights going in all directions. The supermarket parking lot was mostly full, and he could just make out people walking back and forth between the store and their rides. Any other day, and he would say it all looked normal. But if one were to look closer, you could see there were far too many reds and blues of police cars punctuated by the bright sparks of muzzle flashes as weapons were fired. He had just crushed out the cherry and was about to climb down when he heard the murmuring of voices. He thought it might be Bryce and Carl, until he heard a distinctive female talking. It was Mrs. Hamill and her husband. He'd recognize her voice anywhere. She had a very high range, and it came across like she was trying to talk like a baby. He heard his parents talking about it once. It had something to do with childhood trauma of some sort. He froze. It was unlikely they'd seen him, and that was for the best, because it looked as if Mr. Hamill was carrying a knife. Teddy leaned in close to the tree, doing his best to become a chameleon. What is that little miscreant doing up here? Derek Hamill asked.
I don't know, honey, but I can't wait to punish him for it. I was thinking an ice pick through the eyes would teach him a lesson.
Teddy shivered as he heard such violent words utter from someone who didn't sound much older than 5. Where does the app say he is, Sarah? Derek asked.
Not too far. Less than a quarter mile.
You think his scummy friends are up here with him? I wouldn't mind killing an extra 2 brats. I don't know how 2 God-fearing people could create a demon, but I'm thankful we were finally warned. Doing our job to eradicate the scourge is my new mission in life. Did I tell you I killed one of the little fuckers on my way home from work?
You didn't. Remember when you pulled up, I was pulling the thigh muscles out of the Westers, boy?
Oh, that's right. God, that looked like fun. So I'm driving home, trying to get there as fast as possible because I don't want to be the only person on the block that hasn't taken care of their civic duty. And this thing, pretending to be 6 or 7, darts out into the road. I could have avoided him, but the Ford F-250 hardly even felt the thump. The thing went flying like it had wings. The people chasing it waved their thanks at me as we all watched the broken beast crash down into the road and bleed out. Someone came from the other way and ran it over, he chuckled. It was a glorious kill.
I wish I could have been there to see it.
When we're done here, we'll go home. I have the dash cam footage. Caught it all, even when it exploded under the wheels of an oncoming minivan.
Oh, goody!
She clapped her hands together and rubbed them furiously.
Know what else, Derek?
Yeah, hon? He had a faraway sound to his voice, as if he was savoring the earlier kill.
We don't have to share any of our Halloween candy with the neighborhood deviants.
Derek laughed much too heartily at this. Teddy again shivered. He waited until they rounded the bend and were out of sight before scrambling down. If he took a shortcut and was running flat out, he should be able to beat Bryce's parents to the fort. Visibility was decent, but not perfect. He kept his hands up by his face, making sure he didn't catch a branch to the eye. He dove into the entry point and pushed into the fort. He was breathing heavily. Phone. Parents. Get rid of it! Was all he was able to say with his chest heaving. Bryce had a dumbfounded look on his face as he pulled the phone out of his jacket pocket. Carl did not hesitate as he knocked the phone from Bryce's hand and smashed it with the heel of his boot. Hey! Teddy darted over and wrapped his hand around Bryce's mouth. Carl bent over, grabbed the phone, and twisted it around, pulling the SIM card and battery free.
Shit, hon, it dropped off the screen,
Sarah told Derek. Inside the fort, the boys could hear the muffled words. They were close.
But it was right here.
That's the case. So is Bryce. Thing was good to within 15 feet, right? Sarah nodded. Son, it's your father. We're worried. There's a lot of strange things happening out here, and we just want to make sure you're safe. Teddy was impressed. If he hadn't heard them talking, he would have believed Mr. Hamill. Unfortunately, Bryce had not. He was squirming to get away from his friend. Carl shook his head. Bryce continued to try to get away from Teddy's grasp. He stopped when Carl pointed the rifle at his head. No, he whispered. Wait.
Honey, please come out. It's Halloween and you're missing it. Don't you want to get some candy so your father and I can rifle through it and eat the unsafe peanut butter ones?
Sarah cooed. The Hamills stayed quiet, waiting for any sign that their son had heard them. Listen, you demonic shit stain! Get your ass out here! The world needs to be cleansed of your kind. The boy stiffened. Teddy's hand fell away to reveal Bryce's mouth popping open.
Honey, if you come out now, I promise we'll only draw your death out for an hour or two. I know that sounds like a lot, but we have to set an example for others. You duped us for so many years. It's only fair we get to take out our frustrations on your earthly disguise. How dare you cloak yourself in the Lord's image?
Carl knew the Hamills needed to be dealt with. They'd never leave until they killed their son, and there was a good chance one of them would send for help. And no matter how well the fort was hidden, with 20 or 30 people stomping around in the woods, one of them would eventually find the hideout. Teddy, we need to do something about them, Carl whispered. Teddy understood immediately. Bryce was a few seconds behind and shook his head vehemently. Teddy had his hands up, ready to stop an outburst. These are my parents, Bryce pleaded quietly. Not anymore, Carl answered coldly.
Wait, what if this is only temporary and it goes away like a cold or something?
Bryce was grasping. Carl couldn't argue. There was a chance of that. How could any of them know? The problem was, how long would it take? And how long could they stay undiscovered? The little bastards around here somewhere. I swear I can smell them, Derek said. There was rustling, and the chattering couple had gone quiet. They found the path. The tiny light flickered, signifying the tripping of the alarm. Carl shut off one of the lanterns. Teddy did the other. They backed up to the rear of the shelter. Teddy was calming his breath. Bryce's was coming fast. His chest was pounding. The tarp made a scraping sound as it lifted and draped over the top. Moonlight glinted on the blade of the knife as Mr. Hamill stepped inside. Found you, were the last words Derek Hamill spoke as Carl pulled the trigger, vaporizing the man's head and spraying Mrs. Hamill in a shower of brains and blood. Bone shards peppered her face, causing it to bleed as the white projectile shredded her skin. Her husband fell to the side with a wet thud, blood pumping onto the wall and running down onto the rug.
You killed him, you fucking devil!
But instead of coming inside, she turned and ran. Carl, after getting over the initial shock and disorientation from the ear-splitting blast inside the fort, followed. If she got away, she would bring more people, and they could not afford for this haven to be compromised. Bryce fell to his knees and began to wail, heavy sobs racking his body. Teddy was torn. Comfort his friend, or watch the back of the other. I'm sorry. I'll be back. He squeezed Bryce's shoulder. He knew his friend would be in mourning for quite some time, but the life-or-death drama unfolding outside needed to be dealt with now. Teddy expected to hear another rifle shot by now. How fast could a mom run? Fairly fast, apparently, as he struggled to keep up with Carl, who was behind her by a stretch. Sarah Hamill had been a track star back in high school and college, and while not exactly the athlete she had been in her youth, she still kept up with her cardio routine. She would match her speed and stamina with the majority of the population. Fuck! Carl was breathing heavily, and Mrs. Hamill was pulling away. He was not going to be able to run much longer. That was not his forte. He had the rifle, and while he was an excellent shot in video games, that skill didn't necessarily transfer to the real world at a 1-to-1 ratio. He had no choice. He either shot and killed her now, or he headed back to the fort, and the trio grabbed what they could and found somewhere else to go. He could hear footsteps behind him. Teddy came up alongside as Carl did his best to get his breathing under control. She's getting away! You want me to chase her? I've seen you run. Carl had his rifle up to his shoulder. No! Bryce was running toward them. Don't shoot her! Carl pulled the trigger. He had no idea by how much he missed the woman, but she just kept running unaffected. I'll do it. Bryce had caught up. He had the knife his father had been holding. She's my mother. Bryce, no one should have to do that. Carl would never forget the shocked expression on his own mother's face as she lay on the floor, melting, spewing slurred, hurtful words at him through her ruined mouth. Carl grabbed a K-bar from atop his desk and plunged it hard enough to crack her sternum. You little prick, were her dying words as blood bubbled up from her throat. Teddy and Carl watched as Bryce raced after his mother. Do you think he's going to do it? Teddy asked. What I think is that we should pack up and be ready to go. To where? Carl shrugged. He was 15. In-depth plans weren't something he gave much consideration to. Sarah Hamill had shared her love for running with her son, and he'd taken to the sport like a nerd to any new Star Wars offering. Most days he would do an early morning 3-mile jog around the neighborhood. He could easily do 5, but that all depended on how early he got up. He enjoyed his sleep. He used to jog with his mother, but that had been trailing off more and more as she went at a more leisurely pace, and he worked at getting faster. He could catch her, he knew he could, provided she didn't knock on the first door she came to, or he wasn't stopped by another adult. He had just done the last part of the hill down and then up to the train tracks, and she had just reached the trestle. She was halfway across when he called out to her, and her planted foot slipped off the crossbeam and through the gap. She snapped her lower leg with a crack as loud as a .22 being fired. Mom! Bryce had seen and heard her injury. Come closer, dear. It would appear I'm going to need a little help killing you. What are you? He asked. Her voice sounded older, and she'd not even cried out when she broke her leg. What am I? You have the audacity to ask that? I've had the veil removed today, and I don't like what I see. So much evil present in the world. We already knew that, but to have it in our own household pains me more than I can admit. Bryce was steadily coming closer. That's right, my sweet baby. Come to Mama. Let me put you out of my suffering. A distant horn sounded. Bryce and Sharon looked toward the bend in the track about a quarter mile away. Bryce, get me out of here. She did not sound panicked. If Bryce had to put a word to it, he would have gone with expectant. Here was her chance to play into his sympathy, which made no sense if she truly believed him to be a being of pure evil. But with all the strangeness that had happened today, that barely registered a blip. Bryce's attention turned to the rails. They began to hum, occasionally twanging as if they were strings plucked by a giant. Come here, Bryce. We're running out of time, and I don't want to go to the pearly gates without sending you back to the hellfires from which you sprang. Bryce stepped off the tracks and backed up towards the woods line. A halo formed around Sharon as the train came around the turn, and its powerful light shone on her. I'm coming, Lord! She raised her hands in the air as if she were being called by the rapture. The train was barreling down on her, continuously blowing its horn. It was a passenger train bringing commuters back from Boston out to the suburbs. 3 of the cars were on fire. The conductor, instead of slowing to deal with the emergency, had thought he would try to extinguish the blaze by blowing them out with excessive speed. Bryce watched as his mother was hit. He'd not known what to expect, certainly not the explosion that happened. The entire front of the engine was painted in Sharon Hamill hues. The conductor turned to Bryce as he raced by, but he did not slow. Bryce had to back up as the heat from the burning cars became unbearable. I fucking hate Halloween, he said as he peered at the spot where his mother had been. All that remained was the stump of her left leg, and somehow, still on the tracks, was the large kitchen knife she wanted to use on him, the tip embedded deep into the railroad tie. Meanwhile, the town below was a cacophony of sirens and gunshots. He put the rifle over his shoulder and jogged back to the fort. How long they'd be safe there, he didn't know, and he wasn't sure it mattered. This concludes The Parent Plague, a short story by Mark Tufo. Copyright 2023 by Devil Dog Press. The Parent Plague is a production of Chestnut Hill Studios and was produced and performed by Jeff Royds. Mark Tufo hopes you enjoyed this program.